Despite shifting economic tides, Malaysia has charted its own course through Ekonomi MADANI, a reform agenda designed to address deep-rooted structural challenges while promoting inclusive growth. From tackling the middle income trap to narrowing regional disparities and improving fiscal resilience, the roadmap is ambitious, but early results are promising. Yet, how sustainable is this momentum? What lies ahead as Malaysia works to broaden its tax base, manage public debt, and ensure that the benefits of growth are more evenly shared? This is Money Matters. Hello and good evening. You tune into TV3 when you can also stream on Tonton. I'm Zahir Kelvin Ong Abdullah. Joining us to unpack all this today is Treasury Secretary General Datuk Johan Mahmood Merican. Welcome to Money Matters. It's a pleasure having you back with us again.
Oh, well, thank you so much, Kelvin. Good to see you again, especially in this nice new studio.
Thank you, thank you. Can we start off by asking you about Ekonomi MADANI, right?
Yes.
So it was launched to address Malaysia's structural economic challenges. But in your view, which of these challenges, let's talk about the middle income trap, regional inequality or fiscal fragility, is the most urgent and why?
Look, Kelvin, you must have a look, when the MADANI government assumed administration, I think it was very important for Prime Minister Datuk Sri Anwar Ibrahim to really set out some clarity in terms of what would be the economic vision or economic framework for the country's reforms. And it set out very much Ekonomi MADANI. One is an ambition to re-emerge, shall we say, a leading economy in Asia. When Prime Minister was last Minister of Finance, we were one of the ASEAN tigers. Obviously, since the ASEAN crisis, our growth momentum had moderated, and therefore, how do you then reinvigorate the economy? And so, when we talk about Ekonomi MADANI, it has in three parts, as you know. The first, there's a middle part about ensuring good governance anchored on the MADANI values, whether to be sustainable, innovative, compassionate, and having trust in our institutions, and flanked by raising the ceiling in terms of restructuring the economy and also in terms of raising the floor. But we ask about how we prioritize it, but it all fits in together. I think the good governance is, very much an important part of ensuring that our economic progress is sustainable, it's anchored on good institutions, and within that, there is this element of ensuring that sustainable fiscal reform. In terms of restructuring the economy, that's again, you talked about the middle income trap. It's again, how do we emerge a high income nation? That can only be done if we really then become a more competitive investment destination. We ensure that our activities are higher value added, especially moving up the value chain, like in electronics, in terms of embracing digitalization in the economy. But it would be for naught if we restructured our economy, but those benefits were not shared by the rakyat, and therefore that's why we have the raise the floor element, and that's where we want to ensure the prosperity, the well-being of the rakyat. That encapsulates things like ensuring that Malaysians have access to good jobs, good income, access to world standard public services, a priority towards health and education, and ensuring that we have also good social protection schemes. So it all fits in together as part of that framework. And truth be told, in terms of what the government has done thus far, we're seeing good progress. Starting off with good governance, we've heard of many initiatives that's done to strengthen, SPRM, the audit function. But focusing more on the Ministry of Finance, fiscal reform has certainly been one of it. The government instituted the Fiscal Responsibility Act. And as part of that, we've been gradually reducing our fiscal deficit. Prior to the government, it was at 5.5% of GDP deficit. It's been reduced to 5% in 2023 to 4.1% in 2024, and we're targeting 3.8% this year. And in line with that, there's a lot of this noise about debt, government debt, how it's unsustainable. But with the reduction in the fiscal deficit, we've been able to then reduce the net new borrowings of the government. Because as if you run a deficit, you therefore have to borrow more. But by reducing the deficit, what we're doing is that we're trying to reduce the additional borrowings that we're doing. So back in 2022, they borrowed almost 100 billion. First year of Madani administration, it was down to 93 billion. Last year, it was even down to 77 billion, and we'll maintain that downward trajectory as part of the commitment to address debt and ensure it's a sustainable fiscal position. But despite doing that, we've seen that the government continues to be able to manage the economy to ensure that there's strong growth.
So that's what my next question is, because you talk about, despite all that, the growth is there because Malaysia has exceeded its 2024 growth forecast with a GDP increase of, if I'm not mistaken, 5.1%.
Yes.
So, like you mentioned as well, the key reforms or policies under Ekonomi Madani, what do you think were the most responsible for this better than expected performance?
The one part of it, even when I mentioned earlier about fiscal reform, the fiscal reform then combined with this clarity of policies, at least gives that credibility to investors that this is a government that's committed to responsible financial management. And, reducing fiscal deficit, it's never a popular thing, and therefore you've seen the government approach fiscal reform by addressing its revenue base, expanding the revenue base. We'll probably be talking a bit more about SST in a moment, but that along with a few other revenue measures to broaden our tax base, because Malaysia currently, its tax to GDP ratio is only about 2.5%, and that puts us amongst the lowest in this region. So sometimes we think of Singapore as a low tax jurisdiction, but actually we're even lower than that. Probably Indonesia is lower than that. All our other neighbouring countries are, but what more developing countries. And so there's definitely room to expand our tax base, hence some of the SST measures that have been taken. But at the same time, we've also been in terms of addressing our cost base, and therefore the government's undertaking, for example, targeted subsidies. But again, in everything the government has done, and Prime Minister has always emphasized this is a government, underlying the Madani values is compassion. And with that is an always approach in whether it's revenue or subsidies, what we call a progressive and targeted approach.
Right. So you've already mentioned SST, so can we touch on that now? The government has chosen to expand the sales and service tax SST instead of reintroducing GST. What were the key reasons behind the decision, and how does the SST structure better protect lower income groups?
So maybe I start off, even when you looked at the approach the government took with, say, subsidies, you start off with electricity. What the government did was, in 2022, the previous administration, when we maintained electricity tariffs despite the higher fuel prices, what we found was that the subsidy that gets concentrated amongst the higher income, larger companies, large households, where almost 40% was being consumed by the top 20. And so what the government then did was say, okay, those which were of the lower income, proxied by lower consumption, they then continued to get the subsidies. Those were large companies and wealthy individuals were then had to basically pay full market price, and therefore we're able to save the resources required to strengthen the nation's finances, but at the same time safeguarding the interests of the lower income. So a similar approach is taken for taxes, a progressive approach. And even some other measures in the budget. This is the government that's introduced capital gains tax, has introduced dividend tax. Again, the concept is we want taxes to be borne by those more able to bear the taxes. And so even for the SST, in taking the progressive approach, what the government has done is ensure that, say, basic food items, they were not subject to sales tax. In the space of what were seen as premium food items, so I guess sometimes we talk about, I don't know, imported seafood. There was examples like king crab, salmon, caviar. Those were then subject to sales tax. We have other examples where a racing bicycle is subject to increased sales tax, but not normal bicycles. In service taxes, even though we've introduced service taxes on rental and construction, it's only on the commercial industrial buildings, not on housing, for example. So there's always this distinct approach. As opposed to this GST, it's a very broad-based tax, which really covers almost everything. And therefore, what the government has taken is that by taking this more targeted or progressive approach, we then want to ensure that, one, we're able to raise the tax revenue. And ultimately that is to serve the people and the rakyat better, but doing it in a way that is a bit more balanced and targeted so that we do not want to unduly burden
the people.
The people.
Dr. Johan, hold that thought for a minute. We've just got to go for our break. We'll be back right after this. We're talking to Datuk Johan Mahmood Merican. Welcome back to Money Matters. We're talking to Datuk Johan Mahmood Merican, Secretary General of Treasury, Ministry of Finance. Now, Datuk, before we went for the break, we were talking about SST. Now, many economists have written and given their opinion that we had a better system with GST, but it was repealed not because it failed, but because it was poorly implemented. What are your thoughts on that?
I think certainly there were lessons learned from when we were implementing GST. Of course, economists and business tend to look at GST as being a very efficient and comprehensive. Okay. But one of the issues that we faced during the implementation of GST was this issue on refunds, and we had an unusually high level of refunds, some of which perhaps were questionable, and that also then affected the smooth flow of being able to ensure that the cash flows of the companies seeking refunds were addressed. And that certainly was one of the downsides during that phase. But again, I come back to, again, why we chose to do SST rather than GST. So GST, as mentioned, it's very broad-based. And so if we had done GST as opposed to SST, we would probably raise double the revenue of what we're currently doing SST. So the burden on the economy and ultimately the businesses and rakyat would be certainly as a whole more. But more than that, one of the decisions that the Prime Minister said in looking at GST versus SST is that ultimately GST, it's a multi-layered tax, and the companies that pay input tax and then charge output tax, they are able to get a refund for their input tax effectively. And so the company gets a refund all the way up until it reaches the final consumer. So in a sense, GST is paid fully by the final consumer, and that's you and me. And I think the Prime Minister felt that, in really approaching it progressively, he really felt that this was not the time to overly burden the rakyat. It's a time where we're still coming out from the COVID. Let's focus on those better able to pay. And that's why you see elements of the SST which are a bit more focused on the corporate sector. Even like, say, I gave the example of rental and construction, of building office space or industry. Even when we talk about financial services, we exempt the basic banking services that the rakyat needs, but it's charged on fee-based incomes, which typically is a business to business. And so it's a very conscious effort to, again, try to help address the rakyat as a whole, but in a progressive way, ensuring that the burden of tax that we're introducing is better borne by those best able or more able to afford.
So it was reported that with the projected revenue in terms of the SST expansion, 10 billion ringgit, correct me if I'm wrong. So how is this money expected to be spent to directly benefit the ordinary Malaysians?
Yes. So I keep coming back to this approach of being progressive. So on one hand, progressive in taxation means very simple words, you tax the rich more. But progressive in expenditure means you spend more on the poor. And so this is also reflected. So whilst the SST is structured in a way that's progressive in taxing the higher income and corporates, on the expenditure side, more emphasis is paid onto those who are the lower income. So for example, as part of raising this additional revenue, one of the increase in expenditure this year is our expansion of SARA. I'm not sure whether you're familiar with SARA. It's a Sumbangan Asas Rahmah. That's a program, it's part of the umbrella of Sumbangan Tunai Rahmah. That budget has increased from 10 billion to 13 billion. And one specific area is where we've provided over 5 million households the ability where we credit between 100 to 200 ringgit a month. They'll go to a supermarket or a grocery store where they basically can buy basic food items. And that's a way of really helping that segment of society to help them address or meet the challenges of cost of living. In addition to that, in terms of priorities for the rakyat, if you talk about education, we've increased the allocation from 59 billion to 64 billion. If you talk about healthcare, increasing from 41 billion to 45 billion. So it's really trying to mobilize this revenue to really where the rakyat needs it most. And those are, whether it's assistance, education or healthcare, these are the priorities that we want to ensure we serve the rakyat better. And that's how those extra revenues are being mobilized.
Right. Over 75% of MSMEs are exempt from the expanded service tax. So how is the SST reform designed to support small businesses while still boosting government revenue?
Again, we wanted to ensure that, again, in being progressive, we're not just looking after the lower income households. We also want to ensure that the sales and service tax doesn't unduly burden the MSMEs. And that's for the reason, so even when we've introduced the service tax on, say, rentals, we wanted to ensure that those who are MSMEs are exempted from having to pay service tax on their rentals. We also ensure that there is also a higher bar, going up to $1 million to ensure that, again, we don't unduly burden businesses with also the compliance of service tax. So after all, they're not really the main target, and we also don't want to unduly, affect small enterprises. So again, it is the larger businesses which perhaps have the infrastructure and the resources to ensure that they have, they can adjust their systems in order to be able to charge the service tax. They continue to be perhaps where the focus will be, and we are confident that we are then still able to meet our revenue targets without unduly burdening the smaller players.
Okay, Datuk Johan, we've just got to go for our final break. Stay with us on Money Matters. We're talking to Datuk Johan Mahmood Merican. Thank you for staying with Money Matters. Now, Johan, before we went for the break, you were talking about SMMEs. Now, based on the associations as well, what sort of feedback have you gotten in terms of the direction that they want to do, especially where SST is concerned?
Certainly, after we announced the SST revisions, we then received a lot of feedback. Having said that, even prior to announcing it, we had spent quite a lot of time engaging the associations and tax professionals, because since we announced it in the budget last year, we felt it was important to engage with tax professionals and associations to get a better sense. But even then, and we made, during that engagement sessions, we did make some adjustments. So for example, we had engaged with the agriculture sector, which is obviously important for food security, and therefore we ensured that even in terms of introducing sales tax, we ensured that we continue to exempt major inputs, whether it's agricultural machinery, fertilizer, even insecticide. But even having said that, taking on board some of the feedback prior to finalization of SST, post-announcement, there were even more and more feedback. And I think the Madani administration is a listening government. We certainly took on board, and through our engagements, we then did further refinements. So for example, after the initial announcements, we then, there was a little bit of an issue when they raised, because we differentiated between local fruits and imported fruits, and they said, well, okay, we understand, yes, the government has a policy for promoting local fruits, but there's some imported fruits are very, bread and butter basic for the everyday rakyat. So that's why we then adjusted it to say, okay, we'll continue to exempt imported fruits such as apple, oranges, and dates. Coming back to MSMEs, again, they raised particularly in areas such as service tax on rental. So when we first announced it, we had set the threshold at about 500,000. 500,000 where you need to register for charging service tax, but also 500,000 to be exempt for service tax on rental. And so taking on board these various feedback, we then raised it up to 1 million. And therefore, that hopefully then excludes a larger number, a broader group of SME. Again, part of us being doing our engagement and listening to the issue. So we continue to refine. There's some associations that need some clarities over some of, I mentioned there were business-to-business exemptions. These are some of the refinements that we continue to do, but we continue to be very active. The Customs has a hotline to receive phone calls, clarification and inquiries. We at the Ministry of Finance also continue to engage with associations, because we don't pretend that we've necessarily got it all perfect, and we're here to still ensure that where there's a very valid basis, we will continue to look at refining the SST so that we achieve our objectives in terms of raising revenues to meet the rakyat's expectations, but at the same time ensuring that the tax system is still a just system.
Now, you've already mentioned this, but perhaps I can get you to expand. The Madani government, you mentioned, inherited 1.3 trillion in debt. So how sustainable is Malaysia's current fiscal trajectory, especially with over 54 billion a year just going to debt servicing?
Okay, so we've got this 1.3 trillion that comes up to about end of 2024, that was about 64.6% of GDP. As part of the Fiscal Responsibility Act that the government has enacted, we've announced that our medium-term target is to bring back down to 60% of GDP, which we believe is a more sustainable level. In addition to that, as you mentioned, we now have a debt service charge ratio of 16%. That's basically what that means, is that for every 1 ringgit of revenue, 16 cents goes just to paying interest. We're not even talking about paying any principal, just paying interest. And historically, we've always tried to keep it below 15%. So there's already a commitment, announcement to really rein in those debts. And how we do that is by reducing the fiscal deficit. And that's what I mentioned earlier. We've already steadily reduced our deficit, what was previously 5.5% in 2022, down to 4.1% last year, and with a target of 3.8%. And in line with the Fiscal Responsibility Act, to bring it down to 3%, which we see as a more sustainable level. So these are efforts which the government has shown already significant progress. And we're on track in terms of the trajectory to reach those more sustainable levels. I know that there are some noise talking about, has the government delivered? But certainly, it's unrefutable in terms of the reduction in the deficit, the reduction in the new debt that we've, from the 100 billion over to last year only 77 billion. We're certainly making positive progress, while at the same time ensuring that our macroeconomics are still very strong. Even this year, our first quarter growth was 4.4%. Our advanced estimate just released recently was at 4.5%. Unemployment is at 3%, the lowest it's been for a decade. Inflation numbers are moderating down. In fact, in May it was 1.3%, which is again the lowest for over 4 years. But we still recognize that there is a major challenge for households in terms of cost of living. So we know we're not there yet, but we're making great progress, and that's why some of the announced expenditure is also there to mobilize the revenue we raise to help the rakyat, whether it's in facing the cost of living or, as mentioned earlier, the basic public services that they deserve.
Right. Dr. Johan, final question before we go. The government says it is moving away from blanket subsidies to targeted social assistance. So how effective has this shift been so far in addressing, which we're talking about right now, cost of living concerns?
So even when the government had reformed its electricity tariffs, as I mentioned earlier, it made sure that over 85% of consumers did not face any increase of electricity tariffs. In fact, in July, the rates actually went down for this 85% of consumers compared to the first half of 2025, and it is not expected that these tariffs will increase, in the near term. But we were able to get savings because we had reduced the subsidies for large consumers, large corporates, data centers, and even households that have multiple air conditioning. That's a choice they make, but they certainly should be able to afford it. It's more, but the overall 85% of the population was safeguarded. The similar approach will be taken even if we undertake the RON 95. Prime Minister has also committed that more than at least 85% will continue to enjoy the subsidized prices. But what we want to ensure is that the segments, like for example, foreigners, large companies, those who are perhaps smuggling our fuel, we want to address the leakages. It's similar to what I mentioned about revenues. Perhaps the focus now is less on trying to have new taxes, but more on addressing leakages. And so, whether it's, again, targeted subsidies, if we address the leakages, we'll still be able to provide assistance and aid, not just to the B40, but also to the M40, but at the same time, creating that fiscal space to the savings from the leakages to then recycle it back, to then again improve our public services for the rakyat at large.
Right. Dr. Johan, thank you very much. It's been a pleasure having you with Money Matters.
Thank you so much, Kelvin.
For the past half an hour, you've been with us on Money Matters. If you've missed any part of today's show, you can always catch it up on Tonton. I'm Zahir Kelvin Ong Abdullah. Thank you for watching and have a great weekend.